There was a suspected mole that still hasn't been disclosed by the CIA. Our book is the first time to disclose this operation. When it recruits officers, it's looking for people who have what they call ethical flexibility. Sometimes the practicality of keeping Americans safe supersede the morality of how you keep somebody safe.
MK Ultra Midnight Climax, basically dosing people with high doses of LSD to see whether or not this was something that could be utilized for mind control as a truth serum.
I've seen evidence that remote viewing is a very valid, very viable, true, effectual way of a collective of human consciousness projecting itself into a different place and bringing back measurable data. I've seen it. We all are targets all the time. Some of us are being targeted by foreign adversaries. Some of us are being targeted by local businesses.
You have a book that's coming up and you finally got it cleared by the CIA.
We worked with CIA to create the most modern, most accurate espionage memoir available. That was something CIA wasn't comfortable with. We were on the brink of a First Amendment lawsuit with CIA. If people want to know how espionage actually works, if you really want to know the process of putting on an alternate personality, it's all inside Shadow Cell. Shadow Cell is my story, my wife and I's operation together.
She was in too.
My wife was an undercover, covert, clandestine officer just like me. And we're being asked to take on this operation. Hey, we want you to go do this thing. It's basically an impossible task. And while you're trying to do this impossible task, we already know this highly sophisticated adversary to the United States is going to be hunting you down.
They walk amongst us, and we don't ever know it. That's because they're trained with the best psychological tactics to be able to gather information and coerce individuals into giving up information. They're the intelligence operators of this world. And on today's podcast, I have deep cover CIA operator Andrew Bustamante. He's here to share his story of working in deep cover in terrorist cells, in hostile territory, and the techniques that he used to keep himself and his wife safe, but also exposing all of these techniques so that we can defend ourselves against any type of operation that is trying to manipulate or hijack our own minds. How do you tell if somebody is lying to you? How do you tell if you're being coerced? How do you realize if you're a part of some type of operation that is beyond you? Now, of course, the faculties of reason and logic, we get all of that, but there's some deep tactics and secrets that Andrew has graciously offered to expose to help keep all of us safe in these turbulent times and equip us with the most potent information possible. You're going to leave this podcast like a smooth operator, so use this power responsibly, like Uncle Ben said. I hope you guys enjoy this podcast with CIA operator Andrew Bustamante. All right. Well, for those of you joining us, we couldn't help ourselves but start talking. I'm welcoming here Andrew Bustamante. Thanks for being here, brother. And we have so much to talk about, but we're already in the deep end of consciousness and energetics, which is something that would be surprising, actually, to hear you talk about in some regards, because military background, nuclear submarine, CIA, you think this is like rational materialist, reductionist, this is it. But at the same time, the CIA has also been studying altered states of consciousness, from the MK Ultra programs to all of the different remote viewing, remote sensing. Like, the CIA's taken a particular interest in these things that a lot of people would call woo-woo, except I would say that the CIA is probably the least woo-woo, type of structured organization, but they've paid enough attention to it that maybe some people should go like, maybe we should all pay a little bit more attention to it.
They've paid attention to it, and they've paid a whole hell of a lot of money to it also.
Yeah.
And it's because at its core, when we talk about consciousness, when we talk about energetics, when we talk about altered states of human experience, it's measurable. It's energy. And once you can measure anything, it falls into the realm of science. Now, just because it isn't mainstream science doesn't mean it isn't science at all. And going back to some of our biggest rivals in the geopolitical space, whether it's the Nazis, the Russians, the Soviet Union prior to the Russians, even now with the Chinese, these are These are adversarial states paying huge amounts of money, military, industrial, weapons investment, research into finding an edge, an opportunity to take out their adversary. So to counter their discoveries, it forces the CIA to constantly have to be investing in everything from deity idols, whether or not there really is a holy grail, all the way to altered states of human consciousness and remote viewing.
Right. How much is there sequestering of knowledge within the agency, right? Because I would imagine that there's like circles of classification. But if you're in the CIA, do you have access? Like if you wanted to go look, I mean, obviously you're out now, but when you were there, if you wanted to go look into the remote viewing files, would you have clearance to do so, or is it kept within circles within circles?
There's an element of circles within circles for sure, but there's really three main areas. The first and most broad form of research that CIA does, and DoD writ large does, is in the commercial space. So commercial institutions, universities, private scientists, they need funding for their research, and the government will fund their research. The caveat being that the government then gets to control how much of that research is made public.
Right.
But that's not just the government. That's anybody. That's what Coca-Cola does. That's what Northrop Grumman does. Everybody does it. But then the second level to that is when the government goes out and actually requires or tasks a researcher to research something. Now, not only is the government the funding source, they're also the director of that investigation.
Mm-hmm.
So now it can fall under like a classified setting, secret or top secret.
Right.
But then there's the findings of that research, which then get classified into your circles of your circles of your circles. We have privy is one of the highest levels of classification. Restricted access is another. Restricted handling is another. You've got these various categories, even Cat 6, Cat 12, Cat 3, Cat 5, these different categories of circles within circles that say, hey, the government is driving this research and even people in the government aren't able to access this research.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, you've got time periods that are assigned at the moment that they're classified. One of the most common is 25 times 2, 25x2, which means that the moment that is classified, nobody else outside of that access circle can even determine whether or not this product can be reduced in its classification until 25 years have passed 2 times or 50 years.
So there's no moment-to-moment flexibility about that. It's like locked in.
For those 50 years, or for other things 15 years, or for other things 3 years, correct.
Right. So one of the things that I would really want to get into, and I'm sure we'll find our way back to consciousness, because this is like obviously an intersection where we can discuss, I don't know how much you know about my background, but 25 years in the, plant medicine, ceremonial context, experience most of the sacred plant medicines and the traditions in the world. So deep personal experience with this. So I have experiential data that I can draw from. So I'm super interested in getting there. But I want to take a step back and go a little bit more broadly, because the first thing I want to acknowledge is that I am certain that people have no idea how much good the CIA has done, how many evil plots have been foiled, how many lives have been saved. And also, I think people underestimate how many good people, good agents, people who, like yourself, from everything that I can see and feel about you, genuinely intended to do the most good in the world. Like real heroes putting their life on the line for our country, for humanity, so let it just be clear, I think, for everybody that so much good has been done, and there's so many good people in the CIA. And there's bright points where you can look at operations conducted by the CIA and go, yo, that wasn't cool. Like from the MK Ultra operations to then you look at something like Operation Northwood, and you're like, whoa, y'all lost the way, collectively. I'm not talking about you in particular, but the agency seemed to have blurred the lines of morality. So I wanted you to just kind of comment on both of those kind of aspects of this very complex agency.
It's an awesome question, and thank you for acknowledging the first half of that, which is something that so often gets overlooked. CIA is an organization that operates in secret for the most part. And the power of operating in secret is keeping a secret. So their successes remains secret. Nobody ever knows what
Right.
CIA does well.
Right.
And it's because they're so good at what they do that you hear about them so rarely.
Mm-hmm.
The bombs that haven't gone off, the people that haven't been kidnapped, the poisons that haven't been put into our water system, our commercial utilities, the terrible things, the number of hours that our electrical grid has been up and running when people have tried to take it down.
Yeah.
Those are all examples of things that CIA has done very, very well.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that we have remained the preeminent power in the world since the end of World War II is an example of how CIA has done a very good job. And the vast majority of people at CIA are hardworking, dedicated, committed patriots, professionals. They're brilliant, brilliant people. The challenge, like you said, is that sometimes we lose our way.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the practicality of keeping Americans safe supersedes the morality
Right.
of how you keep somebody safe.
Right.
And that's a constant challenge that CIA is dealing with because at its core, it's still a government bureaucracy. So it still has a mission, it still has a purpose, and it still has a funding source that only funds according to the mission and the purpose. It's not like the men and women who work at CIA get to decide what they pursue.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be assigned, it has to be funded, it has to be approved. And only then can they execute on that directive.
Yeah.
So in all of CIA's most famous examples of failure, there's some sort of hierarchy to where the straw house started to fall down.
Yeah, and I think this is something I've heard you talk about before as well, is that you've actually started to come into a deeper faith and actually a morality that's bound by your actual connection with God. And, there's many lenses by which you can look at that. I think you're looking at it through the Christian lens, which is a beautiful lens to view God and view the divine. And I think that's ultimately necessary to temper the pragmatics of the decision-making on a situation, right? Like, it is not the godly thing to do to plan a terrorist attack on American people, blame it on Cuba as the justification to go to war with Cuba, take Cuba over. Now, you can justify that being like, we got to take Cuba over. America will never be down with this unless we plan an attack, blow some Americans up, and then we'll have the justification to go do that. But from like a Christian perspective, you're like, yo, you can't blow up Americans. Like, it's just not an option on the table. You got to look for another fucking option. You know what I mean? But that's the slippery slope of justification. Because if you truly believe that the only way Americans will be safe is if America conquers Cuba, then you can justify all kinds of heinous acts. It's like the debate as to whether Thanos, when he made that snap, was actually a hero or a villain. It depends on how accurate his justification is. But I think there's another way that you can look at that, whereas like every action that goes in accord with greater justification has to be a good action taken. You know, and there's lines that you just can't cross.
And it's fascinating because what you're talking about in our language is morality, morals versus ethics, right? And the difference between ethics and morals, there's a very specific difference that is often overlooked in popular culture. People think that morals and ethics are the same thing. Ethics are actually imposed from the outside. You agree to an ethic, a code of ethics when you become an attorney, when you become a doctor, when you become a teacher, right? There's a organized ethics code that you adhere to. Morals are what you place on yourself. Now, CIA, when it recruits officers, it's looking for people who have what they call ethical flexibility, right? People who are willing to be flexible to adopt different ethics, different morals, depending on the situation. But what ends up happening is when you practice that flexibility for too long, you begin to have no morals, no ethics. When the ethics that you adhere to are essentially the operational requirements of the job, then you really don't have any limitations at all. You just have almost like you have guardrails on the path to whatever mission you're trying to execute. And that is in large part what CIA is designed to be. It's designed to be a tool for the executive branch, the president, right? So point and shoot. That's what the president's supposed to be able to do with CIA in many ways. But that's not what serves the American people at the highest level if you start to project out into future years. And that's exactly what you're talking about. We start to find ruthless, practical justifications for doing things that actually undermine the core oath that we take to protect and serve the American people.
Yeah. So in this other example that I was, kind of alluding to, so MK Ultra Midnight Climax, basically dosing people with high doses of LSD to see whether or not this was something that could be utilized for mind control as a truth serum if our enemies had it in their hands. So the justification was, all right, we need to figure out what this is capable of and what it does. But meanwhile, they're luring people with sex workers into hotel rooms, dosing them with high dose LSD and checking it out and be like, wow. And like, that's fucked up. I've been in the plant medicine path for a long time. You don't dose people.
Yeah.
Like, you don't dose people. It's a bad idea. It's not ethical to do that.
And there's a number of, I'm not going to make excuses. You're 100% right. These things happened. And when they happened, there was a justification at the time. Does that justification hold up to the test of time? I think we're discovering the answer is no.
Yeah.
Whenever you lure an American male into an apartment that's controlled and wired, premeditatedly set up, with a two-way mirror and like oxygen being pumped in through the vents to maximize the impact of the dose that is being like delivered to him via pill or in
have this glass
injection
of champagne, buddy. Yeah.
by a paid sex worker. This is not gonna end well.
Yeah.
No matter how you cut it, right? No one's gonna approve of this in 15 years or 30 years.
Right.
But the question was, if the Russians are doing it, and if they break ground first on being able to create mind control, if they break ground first on remote viewing or on being able to collect intelligence through a psychic link, supported by LSD, if they do it first, well, then that's the end of America.
Right.
That justification is enough for someone somewhere to say, well, might as well try it.
No, I get it. I get this slippery slope of justification. And you can also look at, from a utilitarian perspective, how these justifications would make sense. And in fact, every different war general throughout time has had to make these difficult choices. Like, one of the common strategies in war strategy, just in general. All right, let's say in Genghis Khan used this strategy, and a lot of other people have used this strategy, not just Americans. It's a universal strategy. Send an attack straight to the front of the army, and then a lot of those people are going to die. And you have to say, like, hey, you're going to be the ones who send this attack. Then you're going to retreat, and you're going to get them to chase you. And when they chase you, we're going to be surrounding them in the hills, and then we're going to be able to win this war. Well, how difficult, I've pondered this, to be the leader of that army, or the king or the general, whoever it was, depending on the time period, and looking at your brothers and looking at the people who follow you and like the most devoted and say, you go and most of you are going to die, but you're going to help us win this war. And like, that is an unbelievable and unbearable place to be in, but is actually, necessary for the greater good. So in certain cases like that, you can look at it and go like, fuck, like, I get it. Like, sometimes you have to make those calls, but, I count my blessings that I'm never the one who has to make that call, because how do you do that?
So one of the things that you're touching the surface of that I think is really relevant and interesting is the importance of being able to prepare the mindset of an individual intentionally. So the general who has to make that call, that person's mindset has been shaped and cultivated over the entirety of their 20, 25, 30-year military career.
Mm-hmm.
And it started by recruiting them into an organization that basically said, hey, there is nothing more honorable that you can do for your country than die for your country. And if you think about it, that's what tens of thousands of new military recruits swear to every year, right? There's nothing more honorable than dying for your country. There's people listening to us right now that are like, oh yeah, that's true. There's nothing more honorable that I could do than die for my country. That's a fucking lie.
Mm.
There's a lot of things you can do that are a whole hell of a lot more honorable, beneficial, productive than die for your country. But we've been built on this cultural platform that says, nationalistically, that sacrifice is like the ultimate good, and sacrificing for your nation is the most patriotic thing you can do.
Right.
It's not true.
Yeah.
That in and of itself is an example of the justification that you're talking about. How do we justify the Civil War? How do we justify World War I and World War II? How do we justify Vietnam? How do we justify 20 years of global war on terror? Oh, easy. They died for freedom. Those are men and women who are patriots. They sacrificed the ultimate sacrifice for the greatest good.
Mm-hmm.
It's just us rationalizing something we don't want to face.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough one. I remember having long conversations with my father, and I was grateful that my dad, he talked to me like a little adult from when I was a little kid. And so we were always exploring morality, ethics, all of these different issues. My dad was a good man. And he said that, of all the wars all the wars the United States have been in, perhaps the Revolution, the first one, and World War II were, in his opinion, the only justified wars, because there was a greater cause that was actually worth it, fundamentally in the end. And that's always kind of stuck with me, like this idea, like, all right, well, the Nazis were actually really up to some bad shit, like fundamentally, if they were allowed to continue, the collective human suffering of the world would have been so immense that it was actually potentially a noble cause. But then you wonder, and obviously this isn't proven by any stretch of the imagination, but there's some ideas. And again, this might actually bridge us into this idea of conspiracy. But knowing that the government was willing to at least plan Operation Northwoods, it's quite possible, not proven, we don't know. And I actually asked Bobby Kennedy about this. And he's like, look, we have no idea. But it might be possible that we knew about Pearl Harbor and we're like, you know what? Let's just let it happen, because this is going to get us into a war that we need to get into. But then you start crossing and blurring the lines of like, but what about these men and women who have families and who have kids who need a father, who are at Pearl Harbor? Like, is this really the right way, even if the war is justified at the end? And again, we don't know if that happened or not. We don't know if we were just caught off guard. We could have been totally, or there could have been some awareness of it. And we're like, the higher ups could have just been like, look, we need the public behind this war because we got to get in there. And we allowed it to happen.
And the intel failure, anytime there's an intelligence failure, that same line of thought seems to come up over and over again, right? With the intelligence failure on 9/11, with the intelligence failure at Pearl Harbor, with the intelligence failure that led to, multiple bombings inside of military compounds during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. There's always this idea like, hey, did someone let this happen? And you're right, we don't know. We don't know the answer. We may never know the answer, because that could be the likelihood is very low, but the opportunity is still there.
Right.
What I think is really interesting about that topic is that when you explore a failure, when you explore something that didn't work, it's amazing how fast people try to fill in that gap of information, right? The anatomy of a conspiracy, in many ways, is more interesting to me than the conspiracy itself.
Right.
Because what is it that makes us leap to conclusions? What is it that makes us fill in the gap between what we know and what we don't know? Why is it that we become immediately suspicious instead of just immediately skeptical? Because skepticism is a good thing, but suspicion is not, right? Skepticism is productive. You just doubt what you're told. There's nothing wrong with doubting and seeking corroboration or seeking vetting or seeking additional information. Nothing wrong with skepticism. But instead we become suspicious. And from that suspicion, we believe we're being lied to. Instead of just believing there's more information, we believe we're being lied to. And then we try to find a way to close the circle in our own head. Now, psychologically, that ties back to the negativity bias that we all have that keeps us alive, that survival instinct that keeps us alive. But what's fascinating to me is that even that foundation in how we think negatively is the very reason that systematically the military, the CIA, the DoD, they create these mindsets that are built to combat our own negativity bias. So that when someone is assigned to the mission of Operation Northwoods, by the time they're assigned, they don't say no. they just go forward and execute.
Right.
When somebody is assigned to the mission of Operation Climax, Midnight Climax, they just do it. Because you don't need people having any kind of moral frustration or difficulty when the time comes that leadership has assigned an operation. At that moment, it's time to just execute.
Which is the necessity for high integrity leadership. One nation under God. Like ultimately, I think we've felt this return to the necessity to be bound by a field of value. And a lot of people have found themselves back into a more religious context because it gives this sense of morality. And I've always made a distinction between a warrior and a soldier. To me, the distinction for me is a soldier just does what they're told. And there's a way in which you prepare a soldier, and I think, all blessings to the Marines. Again, brave heroes who've done so much good for the world. But if you look at how a Marine is created, everybody shaves their head the same way. They're tried to become uniform so that they're no longer in the free expression of their thinking. And then you think about a classical warrior. Warrior has their wild hair and it's braided their own unique way, and they have their own, their own armor, their own weapons, their own fucking adornments, their own prayers, their own and they're all aligned by a moral cause, but they're actually free to be in their individualistic decision about what is right and what is wrong. Now, of course, that can obviously cross the line. I think the Vikings were full of warriors, but nonetheless, they had no moral qualms with raping and pillaging. So you have to say, it's not like all warriors are good, but I think there's something different between a warrior who's encouraged to think within their own field of value, like, is this the right mission? And what I'm doing honoring the good of all? Or am I just a soldier who follows orders? And it's easier to be the soldier who follows orders because then you're exculpable. Hey, I'm just following orders. And at that point, it can be very dangerous if the leadership is actually not bound by that field of value or bound by some inherent goodness.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I really think that the differentiation between warrior and soldier is a beautiful differentiation. The way that you just described it, there's a challenge in both directions, right? Because your soldiers of today mature into soldiers of tomorrow, which can mature into very powerful leaders of their own who just execute what they're told. And that's one dangerous kind of extreme. But the other extreme is that you have warriors that develop such a strong independence that they are no longer working for the good of the group.
Yeah,
right?
They can be co-opted by their own self-interest, their own seductions, and they can make decisions that are ultimately harmful to the whole.
And when you look at government, when you look at the kind of decisions that the American government has to deal with all the time, it's trying to strike a balance between the two. How do you build warriors that have a moral compass, but their moral compass is in line with what you as the government want to execute? I mean, if the preeminent example of this, in my opinion, is fundamentalist Islam. Here you have a handful of warriors who are prosecuting a jihad all around the world, prioritizing their targeting of the West first because we are the most antithetical to their belief system, their morals, what they believe to be morally and ethically imperative to the proselytization and the spread of Islam. And that's how something like ISIS can persist even through a Syrian civil war, even after in 2018 or 2020, we say that ISIS is dead. They can persist to a point where as soon as Syria falls, we start prosecuting offensive operations against ISIS in the far stretches of Syria because their threat is that real. And when you have warriors, true warriors, the only way to shut them down is to neutralize them. You can't let even one continue to grow because it's like a wild seed in a field of weeds. It can multiply.
I've always been a collector since I was a kid. Whether it was sports cards, magic cards, comics, stamps, or coins. And as I've gotten older, I've transitioned to collecting original art. I also believe in precious metals as one of the safest and most stable stores of wealth. The impossibly cool thing about my new company, Metal Mark, as part of the Aubrey Marcus Collective, is that it combines both of these things that I love. Fully assayable and recoverable fractional gold notes, paired with impossibly beautiful, cool, and collectible limited edition art. So if for some reason you don't like the art anymore, or the art loses its value, you can always just keep the gold. If any other class of art loses its value, all you are left with is paper, or in the case of NFTs, pixels. And if you are just starting in collecting gold, instead of having to drop $2,700 on a coin like this, you can get in for less than a Benjamin.
It's really interesting because what I'm saying is that a warrior is bound by a field of value. But if the field of value is inherently corrupted and it's like there's an anti-value seeded into it, and you talk about this in the acronym R.I.C.E. And, I'd love to go into that a little bit more, but just to get to the I in the R.I.C.E., this is a way to actually compel somebody into action. Ideology, you say, is the most powerful of those motivating factors. The first R is reward, and then, I'll let you go through the whole one, but what you're talking about is an ideology.
Correct.
They have an ideology, which is they're bound by their own field of value, so they think that what they're doing is good. All actions are justified based on that ideology. And then underneath that ideology, all of the inherent wickedness that's within has a place to flourish. And it's not just the, Islamists that have done that. I mean, we saw that in the Christian Crusades and the burning of the witches and the Inquisition, right? There was an ideology that they were doing good, but then I went to a museum of the Inquisition and I saw 80% of the torture devices had to do with genitals. And you're like, really? In the name of God? In the name of Christ? Like, for real? Y'all really believe this? Like, you fucking lost the way, the truth, and the life in this process because the ideology was fucked up.
Yeah, you're nailing it, right? So the acronym that you're talking about, R.I.C.E., is the acronym that CIA uses to identify the core, what we call the core motivation of any individual. And all people are susceptible to all four of these different motivations, but they vary in intensity and they vary in duration based on where you are in your life, right? So the R stands for reward. All of us are viable. All of us can be motivated by reward. Reward is something that is externally given to you. You're rewarded with a salary. You're rewarded with a prize. You're rewarded with a pat on the back, an attaboy. You're rewarded with a party, right? Whatever. You're rewarded with a kiss at the end of your date. Rewards can be quite motivating.
Totally.
The I is ideology, right? Ideology is motivating to all of us, whether it's your belief set as a Christian or as a Muslim or as a Buddhist, or whether it's just your values as how you were raised. In this neighborhood, we do this. In this household, we do this, right? This is the way it is because this is the way your dad did it and your dad before him and your dad before him. That's all ideology. The C stands for coercion. Coercion is all that stuff that makes us feel bad. Fear, guilt, shame. Those motivate us all the time.
Would blackmail fall under coercion?
Absolutely, right? Something that makes you feel bad. You feel scared to do something because someone else is going to expose you. You feel humiliated, right? You feel embarrassed. And then the E stands for ego. Ego is not the same thing as egotism, right? Ego is how you want to shape your reputation, how you want to be viewed. That's what ego really means. Egotistical means you think you're the best.
But I think that there's something similar. I'd love to hear your distinction between reward and ego, because the inflation of the ego is a certain type of reward.
Absolutely.
In a way, because if like you will be a hero, like your name will echo in the halls of eternity and we'll inscribe this plaque for you and you'll be here. Like it's focusing on the ego really to say like your name will live on in this glorious way or your status will grow. But it is kind of a reward at the same time, but it's a reward for your separate self, not your soul self. This is not but it's interesting. They're related, I guess, in a way.
Exactly. Well, they are related, but then also the important thing to understand about ego is that how people want to be viewed oftentimes is divergent from a reward. Sometimes people want to be unknown. People want to be seen as sacrificial. People want to be forgotten. That's part of their ego, right? You've heard of people who like to work behind the scenes.
Yep.
there's no faster way to upset somebody than by bringing them out from behind the scenes and making them the center of attention. They get really upset about that.
Yeah.
So you've got to let them stay behind the scenes.
Right.
That is an ego-based driver, right? You don't want to reward them according to the standards of reward. You are essentially, to your point, rewarding them by not acknowledging their existence or by not bringing them into the public spotlight.
I understand. All right. So let's say you have a subject, you have a mark. You basically would go through an analysis to see where is the thumbscrew, where is the susceptibility, right? Is that part of, I imagine that's part of your training. It's like if you have a mark, it's like, where is it?
So our terminology is you have a target.
Yeah.
And then not a mark, but a target. And then you assess, not analyze, you assess the motivational drivers of that target, right? And as you assess those motivational drivers, you start to realize, well, here's their ideology. Here's their susceptibility to reward. Here's the ego that they're trying to build for themselves. Here are their areas of guilt, shame, embarrassment, etc. And now you kind of have, if you think about like a musician or the producer of a piece of music, they have that big board and they can turn up and turn down the different dials on the board to blend the music together. That's basically what all of us are, is a soundboard that can be blended. Just the right amount of ideological leverage, just the right amount of ego-based leverage, and just the right amount of coercion at any given moment on any given topic could be enough to get us to take action in a way that suits the handler, the person who's handling us.
I'm thinking back. I took a trip to Moscow when I was probably, 26, 27. And I would have been highly susceptible to a Red Sparrow program at that point in time. Like if they were analyzing me, if they really wanted to get something like that level because of my constitution at that point. Anything else, I've been like, fuck you. Like I'll stand and die for my goodness. But actually if some beautiful Russian came in, and I'd be like, hello, what do you want to know? Like, so it's very interesting to even do this analysis on yourself and say like, all right, where could I be susceptible? Where could we all be susceptible? And not that we're all going to be targets, because God willing, we won't be, but nonetheless, like where are our susceptibilities? And then actually it's almost a kind of like a self checkup that you could do, using that framework to say, like, how could I be manipulated?
So I love the idea that we can use this to improve ourselves. And that's exactly what, if you think about it, all things have two sides, like a coin, right? So the flip side to your motivational levers is understanding that they're also malleable or manipulatable levers. So by understanding your own motivational levers, you can protect yourself from being manipulated. But you can also identify what it takes to motivate yourself.
Yeah.
Right? So there's two benefits here. The reason that's so important is because I agree with you, God willing, we're not all targets. But what's been fascinating to me in my experience with espionage is that we all are targets all the time.
Yeah. There's like global propaganda that's designed to manipulate us into certain behavioral patterns.
And then there's all sorts of different levels of how we're being targeted. Some of us are being targeted by foreign adversaries. Some of us are being targeted by local businesses. Some of us are being targeted by aspiring politicians. Some of us are being targeted by current for-profit news organizations, right? We're all being targeted. And what the R.I.C.E framework allows you to do is start to put vocabulary and structure around the process that has been systematized by all of the organizations. It doesn't matter whether it's NPR, CNN, Fox News, Christian Science Monitor, whether it's the Trump campaign or the Biden campaign. It doesn't matter what the outside organization is. They're all using the same systematic process, tapping on your sense of reward, your sense of belonging if you vote for me, your sense of how positive the future will look for you if you say yes to this policy, right? They're all tapping on your ideology. God wants this. God doesn't want this. Your parents would be proud of you. Your parents would be ashamed of you, right? They're all tapping on your coercion. Oh, think about how much your 401k is going to lose. Think about how much power in America is going to be lost. They're all tapping on that sense of coercion. They're all tapping on your ego. Are you with us or against us? Are you for America or against America?
If you follow this line of thinking, you're better than all of these other people, so you can look down upon them.
Right.
And I think that's this idea that's kind of
gotten in where people are really unaware that a lot of the virtue that they think they have has been co-opted by this subtle desire to claim yourself as better than your neighbor. Like, I'm vaccinated, so therefore I'm better than you. And now everybody who I can look around, I know that I'm better than they are. And so that's like a subtle form. And I'm using that as just an example because it's in the recent mind. And so if I look at, my own pattern, obviously we have a lot of receipts to show a lot of flaws in what happened during the pandemic, and like the way that information was not honestly distributed, in a way that, I have the deepest sympathy for the people who actually, were manipulated during that period. And I think, okay, well, how come I wasn't manipulated? And as the receipts come in, I find myself, having actually seen fairly accurately what was going on. I think the weakness of fear. So all of my plant medicine journeys, I didn't have a strong fear of dying. Like, fundamentally, I've gone through my own death so many times, from my very first ayahuasca journey to all of these other things. I don't want to die. I love my life, but I'm not afraid. So there was not a lot of fear that could get into me that way. So that's one way that you can manipulate someone, is through fear. And the other part is that I don't wrap my goodness. My sense of goodness is not wrapped up in whether I'm better than somebody else. It's wrapped up in my relationship with God, a God that I know.
Yeah.
So that there was there weren't levers that were able to actually affect me in a way. So without those levers, I was able to, have a proper amount of skepticism and look in, and not certainty. I would never say that I was certain about anything, but I had enough skepticism that I was able to kind of navigate through this incredible, what could be seen as like the biggest psyop that's ever been conducted.
There's a lesson at CIA that differentiates between persuasion and influence. And that's really what you're getting at. Persuasion is what it means when you can bend someone to your will in their presence in a moment, right? So in proximity. And persuasion is exclusively based on emotional appeals, right? The fear of death in this case, the fear of embarrassment, the fear of shame, the fear of being considered someone who's unsafe or unclean, right? And if you think about the COVID crisis, the pandemic, anybody without a vaccination was treated like a leper, right? You are the unclean. You are going to infect the rest of us.
Domestic terrorists. Yeah.
That's all persuasive emotional appeals. Unless that's in your face, unless that's right in front of you, it can't affect you, right? Now, when influence takes over, influence happens when persuasion is over, when persuasion ends. It means that even when you're not directly in contact with an emotional appeal, you're still thinking about it, right? That's influence. So to put it in a really, basic form, you're walking down the street, you see a beautiful female, you look at her, she captures your attention. That's persuasion. 4 hours later, you're having a latte and you're like, wow, what about that girl I saw on the street? That's influence. She's gone now, but she has influenced you, right? That's the same way information works. That's the same way the four motivational levers work. You have to invest in persuasion first, which is why you see such aggressive campaigns. Think about when Biden nominated Kamala Harris to run for the Democratic ticket. All of a sudden, it was announced, and for weeks, all you saw was Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris, Kamala Harris everywhere. That was a persuasion campaign to try to build the momentum to have influence long term, which ultimately didn't work out the way they thought it would work out, right?
Right.
That's the way all of advertising works. That's the way all of manipulation works. That's the way abusive relationships work. Yeah. Essentially, you have an abusive partner who's constantly persuading their target so that in the moments where that target is at work, where that target's out shopping or out with their friends, or potentially in a moment where they could execute their own escape from the abusive relationship, they don't. Because the influence of the abuser is so powerful that even in that moment of freedom, the target of the victim of the abuse themselves stays stationary.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is the dark side of how to use influence in this way. Similarly, there's the light side of influence. And this is also a little bit of a slippery slope, because one aspect of morality is to allow people to have ultimate free will. And the other part is like, well, also help them make the best decision possible, right? And I think that's something that every parent, I know that you're a father, and it's what every parent has to do is like, okay, in one regard, I have to persuade and influence my child to make better decisions because it's necessary. They have a developing brain and they need that support. On the other hand, you want them to be able to come to these conclusions on their own, to have the sovereignty of selfhood, which ultimately they'll need, moving forward. So it's an interesting balance, even if your intentions are actually pure and good. How much persuasion and influence do you have and do you use? And I think I think it's a line that all of us, I guess, got to find in our own hearts, right?
It's a challenge because, many of us do it without realizing that we do it. And I think if my life is an average life compared to everybody else, we can all reflect on our childhood and remember those moments where our parents were far more persuasive or far more influential than they probably realized they were being, right? For good or for ill, where they said something or did something that we just never forget.
Yeah.
Right. My mom, when my father died before I was born, my mom remarried. Subsequently, she remarried multiple times, but I was raised by a stepdad who my mom married after my father died. And there was this one conversation that we had when I was 10 or 11 years old. I'll never forget it. And it was an argument I had with my stepdad. I went to my mom to seek her support, and she looked at me and she said, Andy, I love your dad more than you.
Wow.
And I was blown away. And I was like, how can you say that, Mom? And she's like, because, baby, I choose to love him. I default to loving you. You're my son. You're my blood. I'm always going to love you. But I have to choose every day to love him. So I love him more. In my mom's mind, that made perfect sense. It made perfect sense for her for 25 years until she got a divorce. But as a 9-year-old, as a 10-year-old kid, like I'm 44, almost 45 years old, I carry that with me every single day, right? That my mom loved somebody else more than she loved me. Not even my sisters, right? Just this dude who did not count me as his own, this dude who hit me, this dude who belittled me, this dude who, made me feel terrible about myself. She loves him more than she loves me. That's a moment of persuasion that turns into a lifetime of influence on this specific subject.
Wow.
We all have memories like that. We all have moments like that with professors, with parents. Yeah. And this is what sucks about being a parent, dude. You never know when that moment is happening. You never know when you're the one doing that to your child.
I know. I had a crazy realization that, I have one of these moments that ultimately was a positive moment, but at the time it was really not positive. So my stepdad came to me. I was in my 20s, and, I had a little tiny marketing agency, and I was working for him. And right before, I was about to leave and stop working for him and start my own business, he sits me down in his office and he goes, you know what? You will never be successful without me. And I go, oh, really? Like, fuck you. I didn't say that, but that was like, I just kind of nodded and I just like looked at him, and like a little smile like came on the inside. I was like, all right, motherfucker, I'm going to show you. And then I went on to build on it. And maybe I would have done that the same way exactly. I was very self-motivated, but I remembered that. And every hard time, every moment where things looked like it was going to fail, I was like, hell no. I'm not going to go back to him and say like, yeah, well, looks like you were right. So, yeah. And then I asked him, after I'd sold on, after everything worked out so well. And I just came back and I was like, hey, I just want to talk to you about that one moment. It's like, and he was like, yeah, I've been waiting for this moment where you asked me about that. And he goes, I remember, I know, and she's like, I know you because I've known him since I was like 2 years old, so my parents were hardly together at all. And he actually worked for my father. And so like, I've known him forever, even before he got together with my mother. He's like, I remember watching you, and, I'm here in Austin. I went to Austin Westlake. Our big basketball rivals were the Bowie Bulldogs. And so I remember at a away game at Bowie, which is the most hostile environment. You're like literally getting spit on from the crowd. There was like fist fights after the games. It was crazy. It was like 90s, like big basketball rivalry. And I remember that. So I came out of the game, I was super jacked up, fired up. I shot an air ball, like right out of the gate, right? So obviously I got 1,000 motherfucking Bowie Bulldogs just chanting air ball every time I touched the ball. And I just kind of smiled and I just went on a tear. Like got like 30 points, was driving to the bucket, getting and ones. And, I was captain of the team. So it was like, that's part of who I was to do that. But it was like the most hostile environment. I just made the biggest mistake you can make, like shooting an air ball on the road. Everybody's chanting air ball, everybody's chanting. And I get fouled and I go to the free throw line and they're just fucking frothing, games like tied, fourth quarter. And they're just chanting like air ball, everything they could possibly yell at me. And I just looked at the crowd, at the away crowd, and I winked at them. And then I sunk both free throws and then we won the game. And he was like, I remembered at that point who you really are. And you're someone who thrives in adversity. And so I knew that you would hate me for saying that. But I knew that if I said that hate and that adversity that you felt for me would ultimately drive you to be successful. And so I did that for you. And I just started crying. I was like, whoa, like that was a crazy move of influence that he made, like to influence me and be willing to be hated for a long time. Like I didn't forgive him for years, but he was willing to do that. And so it's like, I have an interesting story of a moment like that where actually in that fatherly role, he was like, I know who you are and I know how you thrive and I'm going to make this move that's going to create all kinds of emotional disturbance, but also propel you to your greater success.
Wow. It's, that's a beautiful story. And I'm so happy that you found that closure with him.
Yeah.
Because I know on the other side of that same similar experience, all of my stepdad's relationship with me, we've never had any kind of closure like that. All of the accusations and assumptions and all of the promises that I was never going to amount to anything and whatever else that my stepdad always said to me. What happened is I, as an adult, especially after having my children, when I reflect back on it, I still don't like him. I'm still not happy with him. I still have pain and hurt and anger for him. But I also acknowledge I wouldn't be who I am without him. So whether he thought he was doing the right thing by being a dick, or whether he was just being a dick because it came natural, or whether he just didn't know how to be a dad, which is a hard fucking job. Whatever the reason, there was this moment as a 43-year-old adult of 2 where I was like, damn, whatever it was is irrelevant, because where I am today is because of how he treated me then. CIA calls this childhood trauma because CIA knows that childhood trauma, the right balance of childhood trauma, creates a high-performing adult. And there's this sweet spot where too little trauma makes you an underperforming adult. Too much trauma breaks you and makes you a burden, makes you a liability. But somewhere in between the two makes you this high performer. And it's different for all of us because there's personality at play, there's individual values, there's the secret sauce, the recipe of how you were raised, who you grew up with. So it's not even something that you can replicate, but it is something that, going back to the beginning of our conversation, it is something you can measure. It's something you can test. So the reason that CIA puts new applicants through a 9 to 18 month application process, multiple mental batteries, cognitive batteries, interviews, role plays, et cetera, on the path to CIA, is so that they can get all those data points they need to confirm that you are that right mix of traumatized, just traumatized enough that you need external validation, external direction, you need external belonging, but not so traumatized that you need drugs and alcohol to cope with the day, not so traumatized that you're going to, undermine the agency that you work for in order to spy against the United States because you're pursuing some sort of, super ego. Sometimes they make mistakes with that, but by and large, they have it nailed down.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of, so the difficulty can come from internal sources, or the difficulty can come from external sources. Like you could be actually fighting with your family against hunger, or fighting with your family in a war situation where there's bombs going off and you're having to move shelters and you're having to care for your little sister, and it's nothing that your parents are doing. But it seems like there's that either one way or another, we have to face adversity, and that adversity forges us like a diamond. And so whether it's from our parents or whether it's from a macro condition, you see greatness in people who've had that adversity that's come through them. And I think for me, one of the reasons why I've stuck with the plant medicine path is because it's the most difficult thing I can do. It's always hard. Sometimes it's not, but it's scary. You're completely vulnerable. You have to let go of all control. You're no longer you're subjected to the will of the medicine and the cosmos. And it's so that, and sweat lodges, and then cold baths, and climbing that freezing mountain with Wim Hof, choosing those moments of adversity and difficulty are necessary. Otherwise I become a sloppy, lazy comfort slut, because I have nothing else to bind me. So I have to continue to put myself in these difficult positions. And I think that's something that we all need to realize. It's we have to face adversity in order to evolve.
And we have to accept that we all have a different tolerance for adversity.
Right.
Which is a humbling thought, right? When you think about the adversity that you have an appetite for, when you're afraid, you're able to tolerate that fear to push through. When you're uncomfortable, you're able to tolerate that discomfort to push through. And that is unique to you. There aren't many people who can do that. I have a very good friend of mine who's a Navy SEAL, and we were talking recently about his Navy SEAL training. And he had these moments in his Hell Week where he was like, I don't think I can do this. But he was surrounded on his left and his right by other brothers who had been going through the whole process with him. And they had their own inspiration for him, right? But at the end of the day, he finished, he made it, he had an incredible SEAL career. And now when you talk to him, he's able to reflect on his own background and be like, yeah, what motivates him is always pursuing the next seemingly impossible challenge. That's what motivates him. That's what drives him. So he seeks discomfort. He finds joy in the discomfort. That is not me. I do not find joy in the discomfort. I find joy after the accomplishment.
Sure.
So when I'm uncomfortable, I'm fucking uncomfortable. I'm miserable the whole time. And I'm telling myself, if I can just finish, if I can just complete this, I will be proud of myself. So my gratification is always delayed.
Yeah.
Right? And that's how some people are. There are some people whose satisfaction, whose joy comes from knowing that they successfully avoided the discomfort, right? And that there's not a single thing wrong with any of these people. It's just a matter of, I think to your point, knowing what you are, knowing how you can find that joy, and then prosecuting what must happen in order to embrace that joy. If avoiding the conflict, if avoiding the discomfort brings you joy, then by all means go avoid it. And ignore all the voices that are telling you, you have to go to the gym, you have to be fit, you have to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. Just ignore those voices because they're not talking to you. There's plenty of voices out there who are saying, meditate and journal and go in and find your joy. Yeah. And that doesn't make your joy less than somebody else's joy. But what ends up happening is we get sucked into this idea that there's always something wrong with us. That idea that we're sucked into is fundamentally human. CIA has built their entire human intelligence collection apparatus off of the very predictable idea that people think negatively about themselves, right? That is human consciousness, is the negative thoughts that we have about ourselves. But that doesn't mean that you have to give in to that. It doesn't mean that you have to accept the narrative as a label for who you are and what brings you joy.
Mm-hmm. So you have a book that's coming up for pre-order, and you finally got it cleared by the CIA, and it's from what I understand, because it's not available yet, but it's a fictionalized account of operations, I imagine. So in this, and of course, understanding all sensitivity of what you're able to talk about, but I would imagine that you had field work that involved identifying a target, going through an analysis. Was that something that was like a part of your career? Was actually finding a target, being undercover, and actually utilizing your own methodology to influence it?
Absolutely. That's thank you for using the right vocabulary there as well. Being able to identify our targets and then assess them based on their what we call vulnerabilities. And yes, the memoir that we have coming out, available for pre-release now or pre-order now, it's not a fictionalization, it's an obfuscation. We wanted, it was very hard and very important to us that we worked with CIA to create the most modern, most accurate espionage memoir available. And that was something CIA wasn't comfortable with. So it took years of back and forth. It actually culminated in we were on the brink of a First Amendment lawsuit with CIA, where we were telling them, we know our story is not classified and we know we want to release this. And there's an impetus for disclosure to the American people of this story. And CIA administratively said no. We took it to an attorney, and the CIA's attorney had a conversation, and then CIA said, we agree. You can release this story now as long as you put these obfuscation points into the story. But my point with all of that is, if people want to know how espionage actually works, if you really want to know the process of putting on an alternate personality, collecting information, identifying targets, assessing those targets for their vulnerabilities, for their motivational levers, affecting persuasion, converting that persuasion into influence, and using it all to collect foreign secrets that are then leveraged for national security benefit, it's all inside Shadow Cell. Shadow Cell being the name of our memoir. And I'm so proud that we get to tell that story, because what we did, what my wife being another CIA officer, what my wife and I did in that story is still what's happening today. And there are men and women still undercover today that you will never know, that you will never meet, that will never disclose their CIA affiliation, who are doing that job, putting themselves in the same level of risk or more than we did to protect the American people all the time. It's just like you were saying earlier, right? Our greatest successes never get brought to the light of day.
Right.
And that's what Shadow Cell is. Shadow Cell is my story, my wife and I's operation together.
She was in too.
My wife was an undercover, covert, clandestine officer just like me.
Wow.
And we were a tandem operating couple, and we got to execute these operations that were successful and therefore never saw the light of day.
I've gotten to talk a lot with Amaryllis Kennedy, who has, I don't know if you've ever met her.
I haven't met her, but I know her. I know her story. I know her book. Yeah.
Yeah. So former also high level operator, and we haven't gotten into the details of her operations, except for one fact that she shared is, while she was undercover, part of her cover was to start a business and be an entrepreneur. And so she created a business. I think it had something to do with tech. And she was like, I fucking hated that business. Like, it was the last thing I wanted to do, but I did it because it was part of my cover. And it was actually so successful that I ended up exiting the business. Like, it worked.
Yeah.
She was like, but fuck, did I hate that company? And it just gave me like a level of respect for her, that her like commitment to it and her actual competency was so high. Because you think, like, an entrepreneur, you got to love what you do and you got to like be all in. And she's like, no, I fucking hated that company. But I was so competent that I was able to actually execute this while undercover to such a high degree that the business was super successful nonetheless.
Yeah,
and
it's funny. There's people don't realize that is part of the changing nature of espionage. The Cold War days of, government agencies being the undercover location for CIA officers, those days are disappearing because nobody trusts the American government. Americans don't trust the American government.
Right.
So do you think that like a Chinese person, a North Korean, a Russian, a Turk, you think they're going to look at somebody who comes from an embassy or somebody who comes from the Department of Commerce and they're going to say, oh, let's talk about secrets? It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Yeah. So now there's this changing of espionage operations that are geared more towards equipping operators to create, for all intents and purposes, entrepreneurial ventures. And some of them are successful and are profit generating. Some of them, most of them, are not. Right? They operate at a loss, but they can be creatively accounted for because the funding source is the black budget of the national security infrastructure.
Right.
But what's fascinating is just like with venture capital, the black budget can fund 100 operations. 80 of those operations don't make a dime. 2 of those operations break even. 8 or so of those operations go through the roof, explode, and become the funding source for tomorrow's black budget. Because that money can't come back to the United States. That money, it's dirty money for all intents and purposes. So it can't re-enter the American ecosystem. It has to go back into the black budget and be used to continue to prosecute national security priorities. So to Amaryllis's example, she was able to create a for-profit generating business that was so successful that it feeds the black budget, which feeds dozens and dozens of operations today that don't make success, that don't meet the criteria, but 1 or 2 that do, that then feed the black budget to continue going on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. Have you ever watched either any of the movies or the show Highlander?
I know of Highlander only because I'm a child of the 80s.
Yeah, of course. So in that, there's these certain class of individuals who are like immortal, but they all have sword battles and they actually take each other's power but when they're around another Highlander, another like immortal that's part of this, there can be only one kind of battle construct. It's a great story. Obviously not true. But they have this like spidey sense. It's like, there's another sword-wielding immortal here in the field, like some spidey sense goes. Do you feel like with the level of training that you've had, that you're occasionally like in an environment where you just look at somebody and you're like, wait a minute, like, are you an operator? Like, do you feel like you're more equipped? Because all of us would probably be blind to anybody who's an operator. Like, I'm sure everybody who knew Amaryllis had no fucking clue. If I met her back then, I'd be like, wow, successful entrepreneur. What a fucking boss.
Yeah.
I would have had no idea. But do you feel like you have this kind of, because you've been in it, like this kind of special thing where every once in a while you look at somebody and you're like, I wonder.
I'm going to say yes, but I want to caveat that yes, right? Because a spidey sense is like a sixth sense.
Right.
It's like something natural, something organic. That's not how it works, at least not for me and for many of the operators that I know. What happens is that through the training, you develop frameworks that help you to identify derivations from the norm. So it's very objective.
Yeah.
And you can see how those derivations compile in an individual, especially over time, that then make you assess that they have to some extent or not been trained. We have a concept at CIA specifically, where we talk about trained and untrained. Trained individuals are trained in the art of human intelligence collection. Untrained individuals are not trained in that art. That doesn't mean that untrained people can't collect human intelligence. Right? Some people are good. Some people are very good at getting your secrets. Some people are just immediately disarming and you tell them your life story. There's lots of people out there who accidentally practice very good tradecraft, but they're not trained in tradecraft. Whereas people who are trained in tradecraft prosecute that training in a very specific kind of way. It's organized, it's orderly, it's progressive, right? Meaning it builds on itself. You can see a trained person operating. When an untrained person carries out some of the same skill sets, they don't carry it out the same way. So you start to be able to assess that this person is good, but not trained. So to answer your question, yes, I certainly feel like I know when I'm around another operator, or I suspect when I'm around another operator. And other operators meet me, and it's the most entertaining thing to me because there is such a strong thread in the internet world that I'm not who I say I am.
Right.
And there's people who meet me all the time and they come in thinking skeptically, like, this guy's not who he said. This guy's faking it. He's a phony. He isn't real.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take long before they're like, oh shit, you really are.
Yeah.
You really are a trained CIA operator. And I was like, yeah, what do you think I've been saying this whole time? It's not offensive to me because I know if you're trained, you're going to see it.
Yeah.
Because the same reason I see it in you. And if you're untrained, I don't really care about your opinion.
Right. I became fascinated. I read Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power, and he tells a story of a famous con man named Count Victor Lustig. Have you ever heard any of the stories of Victor Lustig? Well, he utilizes the same kind of methodologies. And for him, and that's probably why I used the word mark instead of target, because for a con man, they call them marks. Mm-hmm. But it is basically identifying a target. And the idea is to not extract secrets, but extract money. And he is the most famous for selling the Eiffel Tower twice. Now, he didn't own the Eiffel Tower, but there was in the zeitgeist in Paris at the time, there was this idea that the Eiffel Tower was an eyesore. And there was all this talk about, we should have never built it. This is ugly. It's ruined the view, blah, blah, blah. Now, obviously now in Paris, it's like the #1 tourist attraction. Everybody loves it. But that was not the case back when Count Lustig was there. And he wasn't a count. He just made that shit up, right? That was not who he was, but that was his persona. So that was him undercover. But he ultimately gathered a bunch of steel scrap dealers who were going to actually buy the Eiffel Tower for the scrap metal, for the iron and the steel that was in there.
Wow.
And he created these secret gatherings where he, forged his own government, papers, and he forged his own government thing. He rented like a nice room, says this has to be kept under top secret, but I'm going to vet offers from you for taking down the Eiffel Tower. And of course, he was not looking for who was going to give him the best offer. I mean, they were all in sealed envelopes. He was looking for who his mark was, who is the most susceptible to it. And so we would identify that. And so he sells the Eiffel Tower to one of these scrap dealers. The guy rolls in with his crew in his trucks. And then the France government's like, the fuck are you doing? He's like, what do you mean? I got this paperwork. I'm here to take down the Eiffel Tower. And they're like hell you are. And what ended up happening is that guy was so embarrassed. He was so embarrassed that he actually got conned that he actually never talked about it. So Count Lustig is out on some cruise ship on a boat somewhere looking at the wires and the telegrams and the newspapers, waiting for this to come out in the news. It didn't come out in the news. So he's like, fuck it. I'm going to run it back.
Again.
I'm going to run it back. So he sold the Eiffel Tower again.
Wow.
But he was, it was interesting just because I read his account, and there's this whole, what was that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio where there's he's being hunted by a federal agent, and Catch Me If You Can. It was like this whole Catch Me If You Can story. So one of the accounts is from this guy who was trying to catch him for a long time. So this is really interesting story. I'm surprised there's no movie. He also conned Al Capone in this amazing, I'll just tell this one story. And he conned Al Capone so the con was he goes to Al Capone and he says, Al, I need $50,000, and in a month I'm going to return to you, $100,000. And Al Capone's like, you realize if you don't, I'm gonna fucking kill you. Right. He's like, yeah, but I'm gonna return you $100,000. So what he does is then he puts that money in a bank vault, doesn't touch it, returns to Al Capone at the exact time, and he says, Mr. Capone, I'm very sorry. I was unable to fulfill what I told you I was going to do. But here's $50,000 back to the penny. You have all your money back. And the con is that he imagined that Al Capone was thinking this was either going to be all the money or he's going to have to kill somebody. But he was not expecting the outcome of getting all of this, all of his money back penny for penny. So Al Capone, after hearing this story, was like, here's 10 grand, because he was surprised. So the con the whole time was to get the 10 grand as the possible reward from Al Capone. So he's playing these crazy high stakes, dangerous games, but understood human psychology in such a unique way. And also, I'm sure, loved the risk of the whole thing. I'm sure he had this huge adrenaline. Finally, he ended up getting caught because he got sloppy and just started getting into counterfeiting. And the counterfeiting was what really got him in the end. But it's a whole account of somebody who had unbelievable talent and was able to tap into these psychological processes and assessments. And it's a really interesting story of someone who was not an operator, but just had this dialed.
So it's funny that you mentioned Frank Abagnale, Catch Me If You Can. When we consider con men, the term con man means confidence man.
Yep.
And one of the most misused terms in our local vernacular is the word confidence. Because what makes these people successful is not their confidence. I would argue that most con men are actually not confident at all. What makes them so effective, what makes them so dangerous, is what courage they have. And this is a case study for new recruits at CIA, the difference between confidence and courage. Because so many people come into CIA recruited for their seeming confidence, their capability, their charisma, their confidence in themselves, their arrogance, right? But CIA very quickly teaches you confident people die every day.
Mm-hmm.
Confident people that don't actually understand their capacity are victimized every day. The person who's truly dangerous is a person of courage. Because a person of courage is a person who can face what they fear and do it anyways, right? They can look in the face of fear. They can know that the thing they're about to do is scary or dangerous, could hurt them, could kill them, but they do it anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a far rarer trait. A person of confidence is a person of courage is a far harder person to find than a person of confidence.
Mm-hmm.
And even though you'll see book covers about confidence and TED Talks about confidence and all you need is confidence, there's a reason you can get it for a dime because that's about what it's worth. Confidence is a misnomer. What's really, truly invaluable is courage. And con men are people of courage.
Yeah.
Not necessarily people of values or ethics or morals, but they are people who can face the unknown. They can face the Al Capones and lie to his face. Right?
Yeah.
Frank Abagnale, the primary case study that we look at is when he's arrested, he's interrogated by the FBI. And the FBI specifically call out this instance where Frank Abagnale is pretending to be a Harvard law instructor. And they're like, Frank, did you ever study law? And he's like, nope. Like, how could you show up to class every day to teach a room full of Harvard law students? How could you show up and teach them? And he's like, oh, I just read the curriculum the night before. So he was always just one day ahead of what he was teaching.
Yeah.
And that to the students made him the smartest person in the room. He knew what he was talking about, but all he was doing was following the same curriculum they were following. He was just one day ahead of them. That's an act of courage.
Yeah.
Every day he was like, one day I'm going to get caught. Somebody's going to figure this shit out. But they didn't, right? That's courage, not confidence.
Wow. That's super interesting. And I also think of this as the ability to regulate your nervous system under these periods where you're under duress. And I think one of the things, like, especially when Canada used to be like the most intense with this when I would cross the border into Canada, the agents who were at the customs when they were checking the passports, now everything is pretty blasé and like everything is, I think they trust the digital thing. If there's a flag, it shows up. But I could tell that they were trained to try to put me under a situation that would rattle me. So they would ask questions like, and they didn't know anything about me, but they would just ask crazy questions like, so what drugs are you going to sell when you're here? I'd be like, none? I don't know. But what they were looking for was like a panicked response, which would come out like if I was actually going to Canada to sell drugs. So they'd ask about guns or something. I'm like, I have no guns. Like, what are you? So, but they were doing it. I could tell why they were doing it. They were doing it to try and get that rattled response. So if someone was untrained in the ability to regulate their nervous system, they would have been rattled. And then that would have brought me into a secondary room of questioning and more kind of scanning. But I imagine that, part of the training has to be if you're questioned or if you're like in a situation where you're rattled, that you're actually able to lower your heart rate. You're able to so go through that process of like emotional regulation and mastery of your nervous system.
Yeah, you're not wrong, but you're also not right on target.
Okay.
So and this is super interesting, and I'm glad you asked this question. So it's your example of that dissonant question at the border.
Right.
Right. That's what they're asking, a question that's not congruent with where your mind is. specifically because they want to see how your mind deals with that incongruency. That's
Right.
essentially what's happening. And they do the same thing during a polygraph test. Polygraph test, truth detector tests are not actually designed to identify if you're telling the truth. They're designed to spark a reaction from a dissonant question that creates a moment of sensitivity. And then what the polygrapher is looking for is that sensitivity. Same thing that your Border Patrol agent was looking for at the border, same thing that they look for whenever you cross through a border at the airport. They're asking a dissonant question to see how you respond to the dissonance. Now, what's fascinating is our assumption is if you're rattled, that's suspicious, when in fact it's the opposite. They are trained to look for a rattled response because it's a dissonant question. It's like me looking at you right now and being like, would you rather have jelly on your French fries or would you rather have guacamole on your French fries? You're kind of like, what? Like that has nothing to do with what we're talking about.
So that is the normal response.
That is the normal response.
Yeah, yes.
So what ends up happening is you've heard of a bell curve, right? So there's a bell curve of autonomic responses, the way that the body responds to stress. And a dissonant question is a form of stress, a controlled form of stress. There's a bell curve of responses, which means that the fat part of the bell curve is what everybody's expecting. But that fat part of the bell curve still has two sides. So there's the side of the bell curve where people are really rattled, where they're like, what, drugs? I don't even know what to say, right? Yeah. That is a typical
So that would be a normal response, yeah.
But then there's also a side of that where people are just like, none.
And just so cool.
Because it's normal. Like, and that's part of the bell curve.
Interesting.
It's the two extremes on the bell curve.
So they're looking for both.
So they're looking for both sides, but they're looking for that rare response, which is a response that is effort driven, right? The true flag when someone's lying to you, the true flag when someone's being dishonest is the effort that they have to put into the response. If they don't put much effort into the response, if it's timely, if there's eye contact, if it's almost immediate, then you know that that's truly them responding without any sort of logical processing involved.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether they freak out or whether they seem cool as a cucumber. When it looks like they have to put effort into it, then that's how you know you've got something interesting going on. When the person pauses and considers their answer, or when they look away from you, or when they give you a few too many words, or when their body doesn't match with their pace, so they're moving their hands, but they're talking very, very comfortably. Right? Those are the kind of signals that you're dealing with somebody who's putting effort into their response.
Yeah.
So that's what you're trained to look for. Our training, to your point, our training for how to combat that is to first identify what is our natural response. So when you're crossing a border in alias, you're saying you're French, you're not French. You're saying your name is Jacques, you're not Jacques. You're saying you're 50, you're not 50. You're saying you're here for tourism, you're not fucking there for tourism. Right? Your job and the reason you go through so much training is to identify what is your natural response to questioning.
Yeah.
Are you naturally a nervous person? Are you naturally a calm person? Are you naturally a talker? Are you naturally like tight-lipped? And then as you understand what your natural response is, then you train yourself for that natural response. Because to the observer, to the Border Patrol agent or the interrogator or the polygrapher, to whoever the opponent is, they're looking for a derivation from your norm. So if you can just practice your norm, you can be Jacques the Nervous Nelly.
Yeah. That's so interesting. It also reminds me of poker as well, because in poker you're looking for tells, which are derivations from the norm.
Yes.
And I understand the fundamental principles and guiding outlines for poker, but for whatever reason, playing poker, even if the stakes are lower than the stakes that I wager on my life and my business and whatever, even if it's like a seemingly meaningless amount, if I got a good hand, like I just feel differently. And I know I feel differently. And so I'm not like if I get with like good poker, but I get crushed, because I'm not good at that. But then you watch like the World Series of Poker and people, they just practice being the same no matter what, the way they go all in or the way they don't, or they're in their norm and they create this kind of pattern of how they are, which then allows them to operate in a way. And I suppose it's the same way for an agent.
It's very similar for us and for professional athletes as well.
Yeah.
So what I would argue is that the difference between poker and professional athletics and the federal government with its tier 1 and its elite intelligence operators is that everything government-wise has an unlimited budget. So the training that we're given, the ability for us to practice, for us to fine-tune and process our skills, it far surpasses what you see in professional sports because of that unlimited budget over time and the fact that, you've got 20-year careerists who are training 10-year mid-careerists who are training 2-year new recruits, and it's just cultivated, which is not something that exists in professional athletics. So your poker example is a great example of people, what we call whitewashing. They're removing their emotional response in order to create a very stable foundation. And then that's what they practice. They practice the whitewash. They wear crazy shit to distract each other, to try to get each other off of their whitewash.
Right.
But if everybody could just show up in a t-shirt and shorts, it would be the most boring thing in the world because you'd have, 8, 10, 12 people around a table all looking the same, acting the same, doing the same thing. Right. That's a whitewash. Professional athletes, they're terrified every day of when they're rattled.
Yeah.
Because their livelihood is tied to their ability to deliver performance at certain moments, on certain days, at certain times, for a limited period of time, and then they want to renew their contract at the end, and at any given time, their contract can be taken away from them. So they're always afraid of being rattled. So for them, it's like the exact opposite. They're trained and optimized and mentally tuned so that they can overcome when they start to feel the anxiety, when they start to feel the fear. They're given all these tools to try to combat it. They never just accept it. They always combat it. The exact opposite of the whitewash, where they just remove it altogether and then they just become something new. Whereas your operators, your Navy SEALs, your Delta operators, your CIA operators, your undercover narcs for the drug enforcement agency, we're taught that you're a natural way, and that natural way is sustainable if you adhere to your natural process.
Yeah.
Because you can do that for weeks, months, years. What happens is if you put something unnatural in place, you're going to run out of energy. And when you run out of energy, the whole operation comes falling down. So we're taught to find a way to do what's natural for us. It's natural to shut down and clam up, or it's natural to get talkative. It's natural to get nervous, but whatever is natural for you,
it's consistent.
Let's tune it to make it very consistent, no matter what name you're saying you're under or what task you're saying you're there to do.
Yeah. I want to talk more about detecting somebody who's lying. Because, I've been blessed. I've been in a lot of beautiful relationships, and there hasn't been, infidelity or like big lies of any sort. But I've noticed what you could call, if it was a poker term, like tells when my partner is expressing something uncomfortable. And it's been pretty consistent, actually. Pitch of their voice goes up beyond that normal. And I've also noticed that there's sometimes like a pattern of yawning. It happens. Like, so the pitch goes up and all of a sudden there's these like little yawns that come out. And I'm like, you're uncomfortable with what you're saying because you're maybe afraid that it's going to be something sensitive that you're sharing. It's a truth. It could be even a truth, that you're just afraid of the sensitivity of my potential reaction to that truth. But I've noticed this and I just kind of laugh about it. And sometimes I'll point it out. I'll be like, look, your pitch is a little high here and you're yawning. So like, why are you uncomfortable? What's going on? But so for you, and I've just noticed that on the personal side. I have no particular training in this, but what are you there? And I've also heard things about people when they're accessing truth, look up, or when they're lying, they look down. Like, what are some of the things that you do as like a human lie detector to see if someone's actually comfortable with what they're saying or not?
Lie detection is not about micro expressions. And there's a lot of false TikTok clips and Instagram clips and reels. There's all this stuff out there about micro expressions. And micro expressions don't work unless you have a baseline for the person that you're assessing, which is why it works so well for you with your partner. Because you have lots of hours of exposed time. You understand your partner's baseline, what's normal. And then you can identify the derivations from the norm, just like you said. That doesn't mean that lie detection can't be used against a stranger. It just means you have to understand what you're looking for. Instead of looking for micro expressions, you're looking for macro observations, large observations. Your point about how your partner's pitch increases when they're uncomfortable, That's a micro expression. Not everybody's pitch increases. Some people's pitch actually goes down. But for your particular partner, it goes up. That's essentially a micro expression of a tell for them.
Yeah.
Yawning, on the other hand, yawning is a macro observable.
Yeah.
Because whenever we're putting effort into anything, the more cognitive effort you put into it, the more cortisol is created, the more that the body then demands an increase in oxygen flow,
Whoa.
and the frequency of yawning occurs.
Whoa, super interesting.
If you've ever seen if you remember being a kid in a boring class in middle school or elementary school or high school, what did you do all the time? Yawn. Even though you got a good night's sleep.
Yeah, totally.
You're like, why am I yawning right now? I don't even know. Right? It's because there's all this stress in your brain and your body's saying, I need more oxygen to support this cortisol processing. So you yawn.
Yeah.
Yawning is a clear macro observable indicator of increased effort. So effort's your best way of telling if somebody's lying to you. Just like if you're at the border of Canada and the United States and you ask about drugs and that person yawns.
Yeah.
Now you're like, oh, you're putting some effort into this. Right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that you're looking for. One of the best tells that are macro in nature actually have to do with the questions that you ask. So there's two really powerful tells that you can look for when you're trying to determine if somebody's lying to you. The first is called a chronological question. The second is called a feelings question. These are two types of questions that are strong at identifying if somebody is fabricating to you, right? With a feelings-based question, you ask them how they feel about a specific moment in time, right? And then you see their response. In a perfect world, you do this with somebody who doesn't know that you're testing them for lie detection, right? But if you think about it, whenever somebody is asked an emotional question, a feelings-based question, the low effort response is real. The high effort response is repressed, right? So for example, my grandmother died recently. I was very close with my grandmother. So if anybody asks me a feeling-based question about my grandmother, it's going to be very natural right away for me to feel the true feelings that I felt about my grandmother.
Yeah.
So if I lie about my true feelings, there's going to be a delay in time. There's going to be an amount of effort that you can see and hear, see in my facial expressions and hear in my voice. Because a feelings-based question is something that's very difficult to get rid of, right? So for example, was your first experience with plant-based medicine something that made you happy? Everybody who just watched that response knows that whatever you're about to say is going to be true, right? Because as soon as I finish the question, if you guys can play it back, your face told the whole story. Whatever you're about to say is taking no effort from you. You lit up, dude.
Yeah.
Your face just lit up.
Yeah.
Right? That's a feelings-based question.
Right.
So now if I saw your face, like you smiled, I don't know if you noticed, like you smiled possibly bigger than I've seen you smile the entire show.
Totally.
Now, if I saw that smile happen and then I saw that smile change before you started to answer, now I know that you're introducing effort.
Yeah.
Right? You're introducing effort, which means that you are cultivating the response so it's a less honest response for whatever reason. Maybe it's because you don't want to admit to it, or maybe because you don't want to confuse me. Who knows? But you're about to alter your response if I see that change.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes total sense.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you finish.
The second example is what's known as a chronological question. I want to equip you with both of these.
Yeah, no, this is great.
The second example is a chronological question. Now, the chronological question is partially tied to your native language. Because if you're part of a native language, it reads from left to right. Or if you're part of a language that reads from right to left, if you're part of a language that reads from top to bottom, if you're part of a language that reads from bottom to top, it changes what you're supposed to be looking for. But essentially, the idea is that when you challenge somebody with a chronological question, their natural response is going to be for their eyes to go to the same place that they would reference a timeline, right? So if I ask you, what was your favorite birthday before you were 13 years old? So people can see already. People can see your eyes. They saw your eyes go up because your native language is English.
Yeah.
And then they saw you scan from left to right.
Yeah.
So you're
That's so
actually,
interesting.
you're referencing your own history.
Right.
You're trying to find what was the best memory. If you were lying, or if you were trying to lie, I would see you reference the right side of your...
like kind of look down and
Yeah, and you would say,
interesting.
what's my creative brain what's the best answer? Not, what is the history? You replayed your birthdays.
Right.
Whereas somebody who's fabricating is creating something new, right?
Yeah.
The looking up or looking down is less impactful as much as addressing the chronology of the timeline.
That's so interesting to think about. It also looks at like this kind of neuro-linguistic archival process of the brain, and actually how we read is actually how we read our own brain.
It's how you read your brain. It's how you read another person's face.
Yeah.
One of the key pillars to disguise is actually understanding that when people look at you, they look at you the same way that they read a page. So that means when people look at you, they look at the upper left corner of your face before they look at the lower right corner of your face. And that's why when you ask somebody to describe someone that they saw once, what can they usually recall? Hair color, skin color, hair texture.
Yeah.
Because that's identifiable in the upper right corner of your face, upper left corner of your face. They have a hard time remembering if you had a beard. They have a hard time remembering if you had blue eyes or brown eyes, because the first thing their brain looks at is it's just like reading a page. They look up there. You could have a fucking peg leg over here and they wouldn't remember because they look there first, right? And that's when you're building a disguise, you're building it to accommodate how they're going to look at you. When you're building a lie, you're doing it the same way so that you know how you're going to reference the information in that lie.
And then, so if, let's say, I think, so like in Hebrew texts, you read, bottom right to top left, right? So if that was your native text and that was the native way that you would do it, someone might say, they were wearing sandals. And they were like, so it could go in a certain way. And I know that, in marketing, we always think of like how we organize a page. And we understand that people are going to look from that top left down to bottom right. So there's a kind of a way that people are going to go. But then I imagine if you're doing advertisement in China or in, Israel and Middle East, you would actually organize things differently because that's the way that the mind would start to track.
Exactly. So think about all the international businesses out there who are taking their American webpage and then they're translating their webpage, but that's all they're changing. Yeah. The most important information is still in the upper left corner. Yeah. The logo is still in the upper left corner. Instead of being like, hey, we're translating this into Hebrew, let's flip the whole thing on its side.
Right.
And the most important thing should actually happen in the lower right corner of a landing page. Right? People, they're not even thinking about it. This with Chinese, they read from top to bottom before they read from left to right. So you want to put all of your best, most important nuggets kind of on the left-hand side of the screen. Your best pictures, your best graphics, your best CTA. Because by the time they get to the right side, they're not even paying attention.
So you work with people, high performers, athletes, entrepreneurs. What are some of like the tenets of things that you like really use to help guide people to their own optimal performance? Because I haven't had a lot of training, but I understand the basics of psychology. And I also understand through my own experience being a competitive athlete, like I know when I get super hard on myself after I miss a shot or do something like that, my performance goes down. So you learn like, one, don't ever show your opponent that you're doing that because that gives them extra juice, right? So they're fired up, and also it doesn't help your own. So you learn certain things like, all right, I can't do this. I can't allow myself to do this unless I want my performance to suffer. But for you, who's had not only experience, but also training, like where do you start in helping someone's mental architecture?
So there's the marketing answer. And then there's the real answer, right? I'll start with the real answer because you'll understand the marketing answer right away. The real answer is that I start the moment that I meet them, because what they say, how they say it, how they communicate, it's all data. It's all information that helps you understand the person as they really are. The marketing answer is that we start by getting people to recognize that they aren't as bad as they think they are, right? And that's the true reality of all high performers. Every high performer thinks that they're a shit show. Every high performer thinks that they're fucked up. Every high performer thinks they're an asshole. Yeah. Every high performer thinks that they're alone and that they would be happier if they were not a high performer, right? They all think these horrible things about themselves. It's just the hallmark of a high ambition person.
Mhm.
That's why you have so much ambition, because no matter how good, how successful, how accomplished you are, you're not as accomplished as you could have been,
Right.
right? So it's that voice of our parents or our professors in our head all the time. So in between those two is where the real first step happens, because how someone talks to you, how they define their own problem statement, whether they prefer to email or text or phone call or video call or meet in person, all of these are data points that help you understand the person.
Mhm.
Are they an introvert? Are they an extrovert? Are they organized? Are they disorganized? Efficient? Inefficient? Right? Are they a people person? Are they guarded? And then it just evolves from there. But when it comes to the tenets that we try to get people to teach, one of the most important tenets that I try to get anybody to understand is that whether you're a high performer or a non-performer, we are all wired for survival.
Mm.
Mentally, behaviorally, biologically. The first, most imminent issue facing us is the issue of surviving, not thriving.
Mm.
So when it comes to how we identify and how we prioritize our resources, we're all prioritizing our resources towards survival first, not towards thriving first. So even if we are risk tolerant, even if we are people who like to be on the leading edge, even if you are a con man and you have the courage to try to keep pushing forward, what's haunting your thoughts is survival.
Mhm.
It takes up so many calories. There's been multiple cognitive studies done that show how much negative thought goes through a person's head. Do you know the number of how many negative thoughts the average person has in a day?
No.
48,000 negative thoughts.
Whoa.
48,000 negative thoughts and approximately 65-ish thousand thoughts a day. And of those 48,000 negative thoughts, between 85 and 90% of them are repetitive. Repetitive in the day, repetitive day after day, repetitive hour after hour, minute after minute, right? I'm not good enough. I need to lose weight. I'm going to forget this. This person doesn't like me. I'm a jerk. Thoughts day after day after day after day after day, right? Just constantly playing in our heads. That gets amplified for high performers, because now high performers are adding to their list of I don't like my beer belly and I'm never going to get a date.
Yeah.
It's amplified to also I'm never going to hit that goal.
Yeah.
That's too ambitious. That's not realistic enough, right? I'm not spending enough time with my kids. I'm not spending enough time with my spouse. Who knows what, right? I'm getting grayer in my beard. I'm getting grayer in my hair. The amount of negative thoughts is just incredible. Empirically, all the effort that goes into those negative thoughts is actual caloric effort.
Yeah, because the brain consumes an enormous amount of energy. I think like the numbers are like 40% of all available energy is utilized by the brain.
So that means the banana you're eating is to fuel those negative thoughts. How fucked up is that, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So a big part of it is understanding like, hey, your survival is not at risk here. And once you show people like, hey, your survival's not imminently being threatened, right? If you are an athlete and you don't perform for multiple games, for multiple weeks, then your survival might be at risk. But if you have a bad game, if you are called in like professional footballers, American footballers, you're called in to kick the field goal in the final minute, yes, you are paid to score the field goal. But if you miss it, that doesn't mean it's the end of your career.
Right.
Right? You miss it a few times, it's a different story.
Right.
So it's about getting people to take the energy that they're investing into all the negativity, the anxiety, the fear, the worry, the self-doubt, the self-criticism. If you can take that same energy and redirect it into something positive or progressive, increasing your risk tolerance is something that we can actually measure, improving your biooptimization, your heart rate, your lung capacity, your VO2, etc. Those are all biologics that we can actually measure. When you start to change those things, it transforms your entire outcome. It starts to make it so you're not putting your effort into survival, you're putting your effort into thriving instead.
Yeah, this draws me back to that issue of faith as well, because if you know that your success or failure in this personal avatar is relative and subject to the world, and sometimes random chance. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you do your best and it's not good enough, and etc. But if you actually have a relationship with God where you know, like, actually I'm right with God, and no matter what happens, like, that's the thing that matters the most. You see a lot of people in a deeper state of peace, especially when that religion doesn't have a lot of fear imprinted, where it's like, I might be sinning right now. This thought that I just had as this woman crossed the street, I'm a sinner now, and I got to go. There's obviously negativity that can be associated with religion, but a lot of people of faith, they have this kind of mental resiliency that you see, because it's like win or lose the game. Like, as long as your relationship with God is in the right place, you actually feel okay.
Let me give you a case study on exactly what you're saying. Do you know what state in the United States has the most effective, what are they called? Telemarketers. What state in the United States has the most effective telemarketers, telesales teams?
No idea.
Utah.
The Mormons.
And they are Mormon. Now, this case study is so powerful because what is the biggest challenge for most new entrepreneurs and most business owners? Selling. Because even though they believe in their product, even though they believe that it can deliver the outcome, they still feel slimy making the sale.
Right.
Sales is not an easy skill to just be born with. The idea of having a conversation where you know that the end goal of this conversation is for them to give you money, and you have to eventually ask them to give you money, that's a hard thing. And I can't tell you how many entrepreneurs, even seasoned CEOs, still feel guilty about selling.
Yeah.
Right? So we always go back to this case study of the Mormons in Utah. Well, what makes them so effective? There is a tenet in the Christian faith where God gives people spiritual gifts. And various spiritual gifts have different elements of human value to them. Some spiritual gifts make you good at caring for people. Some spiritual gifts make you good at connecting with people, etc. But the idea is, if you have something that you believe in, something that you believe would make the world a better place, something that you believe would expand the kingdom, how could you not do everything in your power to get that product out to as many people as possible?
Right.
And if you get the product out to those people and they buy it, how could you possibly feel guilty about it?
Sure.
Because clearly it's ordained that that person should have that product, just like you have been ordained to be the person who carries forward and proselytizes that product. So that whole concept of it being spiritual in nature is what makes these telemarketing and telesales teams in Utah super powered, because they don't carry any of the guilt. They don't spend any calories feeling bad about what they sell. They don't spend any calories about the person who doesn't give them a chance to sell on the phone, about the person who hangs up on them right away. Because instead, they're focused exclusively on, well, that person wasn't ordained to have it. That person wasn't ordained to have it. That person wasn't. My job is to find the ordained person out there. And it completely transforms the name of the game for them.
Man, this is super fucking interesting. I want to go back because, I would feel remiss if I didn't give you a chance to tell a story, and of course, in the obfuscated fashion that allows you to tell a story. But tell us a story. Tell us a story of you in your operation days that you can tell, and that was really interesting, something that stands out. And so that we can just get a flavor of what we might be able to see in the book Shadow Cell when it comes out.
Absolutely. So that's exactly what I'll reference is the operation in Shadow Cell. So when my wife and I chose to write the book, we knew that our operation was very classified. We were working against a leading edge adversary to the United States at a very contentious time in American history, as you know, between the Trump presidency, the Biden presidency, the Obama presidency, et cetera. And we wanted to tell the story. And then in addition to that, not only were we talking about operations that were clear, current, and relevant, but we were also talking about operations that were experimental, possibly on the edge of what you would call losing the way. So my wife and I were junior officers. We joined CIA in 2007. When we were called in to take on the challenge of what became Shadow Cell, it was an operation where there was a suspected mole within CIA, a mole that still hasn't been disclosed by the CIA. Our book is the first time to disclose this operation. And they needed operators who were so new to the agency that they would essentially be unknown to this mole.
And so the mole would be called like a double agent, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
A person who works for CIA but is informing an adversarial country.
Right.
And the process, it's not easy to route a mole. You have to find them, and then they're American citizens. So when you find them, you then have to build a case against them because FBI has to build a case that could be prosecuted in front of a panel of peers, right? So that takes time. And you can't really change what that mole has access to because if you take them out of their position of access, they may no longer be important enough to send information to their adversarial country. So it's a very, very sticky game. You have to essentially choose what operations to intentionally compromise to an adversarial country. So apparently my wife and I were so good at what we did that they were like, oh, these are two people we can compromise without any problems. So we were chosen to build a new set of operations knowing full well that there's a mole out there trying to find and compromise us, which was a very difficult question to take on. Because here you are, my wife and I are 3 years into our career, very good at what we do, and we're being asked to take on this operation that's essentially a suicide mission. Hey, we want you to go do this thing. It's basically an impossible task. And while you're trying to do this impossible task, we already know this highly sophisticated adversary to the United States is going to be hunting you down because the mole is going to be telling them about your whereabouts. And we're not going to...
Fuck, bro.
We're not going to protect you from the mole because if we protected you from the mole, then the mole would lose their interest. So my wife and I did not have an easy task ahead of us, but we said yes. We said yes because that's what you do.
Yeah.
You don't say no to a career-making opportunity. You don't say no when your country needs you. And we're all brainwashed at the time to believe there's nothing more valuable than sacrificing yourself for your country, right? So that's when we went out and started the operation for Shadow Cell. We were on our own to try to find a way to protect our operation. We didn't have a lot of intelligence experience, so we didn't know how to use technology. We didn't know how to build the perfect disguise. We were still junior enough that we were used to everybody giving us what we had. But what we did know was terrorist operations, because that's what every junior officer knows. So what we decided to do was we decided to create new operations against this adversarial country that were modeled off of fundamentalist Islam. So we created our own little terrorist cell that we call the Shadow Cell. And we were given approval by CIA to create our Shadow Cell and prosecute operations against the adversary because CIA thought that eventually we'd get caught by the mole. But the kicker is that the mole ultimately found us only after we had years to prosecute these operations. When the mole found us, they found me first. I was in a foreign country. I was in the adversarial target country. And I was carrying out an op. And then all of a sudden I had a surveillance team on me, and I could identify my surveillance team. As I was trying to navigate my operation, the surveillance team grew. It grew in size. It grew in sophistication. And that was my big telltale sign. Like, we know in the intelligence world that when you have a advanced surveillance team on you, they're building towards what we call a roll-up or a takedown operation. So I knew that I'm in a foreign country in a foreign alias. I'm Jacques when I'm not supposed to be Jacques, and I'm not there for tourism kind of thing. We knew that there was a climax coming, and if I didn't get myself off the X, I was going to be rolled up, executing an operation based off of fundamentalist Islam in a foreign country with plausible deniability by the CIA. So it was the worst case scenario for us. And I was able to fire off an encoded message to my wife that couldn't say anything substantial, but I was able to tell her in coded language that I'm under observation and I don't know if I'm coming home. The rest is in the book. How I actually get out of the situation and what I actually do is all part of Shadow Cell. But the really exciting part for us is that when I got back home, when we were able to demonstrably demonstrate that our new methodology worked, that it wasn't us losing the way, but it was us finding a whole new way, CIA took our methods and made it agency-wide. So then Mike Morrell, when he became CIA director, launched a whole new initiative to reorganize the entire CIA into the same model as our operation. And Shadow Cell became something that was so classified that they didn't even acknowledge its existence as a model for how they reorganized the Central Intelligence Agency. And now, thanks to the Trump administration's willingness to roll back classified information, we were able to propose to CIA, hey, we would like to release this story.
Yeah.
We think it's a good news story. And there are thousands of operators all over the world right now executing based off of the Shadow Cell methodology.
Wow.
And it's not telling our adversaries anything about our operations to know that, because the 20 years that Americans fought and died in the global war on terror, Russians weren't dying in the global war on terror. Chinese weren't dying in the global war on terror. North Koreans weren't dying in the global war on terror. We have 20 years of competitive information on how terrorists and terrorist cells work. We can now use that to protect Americans. And I don't think that's losing the way, but some people will.
Right. Yeah, I mean, those questions are obviously very complex, but, you know, it seems like, first of all, blessings and thank God that you made it home. I mean, it sounds crazy. And I think all of us go to these kind of fictionalized versions of what somebody who's a spy like James Bond or Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible, whatever the fuck his name is, you know, and we imagine like that. So, but what is the actual amount of combat and weapons training that goes in to make you guys capable if it comes down to moments of crisis and violence? I mean, all the James Bond movies and Mission Impossible movies always have moments of like intense physical conflict. Are you guys trained at that level as well? Is that like a big part of this, especially if you're working in like an overseas, you know, dangerous area? Like, are you ready to fucking bust out some special moves and stuff?
We are all trained in weapons and hand-to-hand combat.
Yeah.
But I will also say that we're trained in those things as an area of last resort.
Of course.
Because you can't be an undercover tire salesman in Tbilisi if you're carrying a 6 Sauer concealed in your back pocket. You can't do it. So we're trained how to use local weapons.
Yeah, just a librarian that's just fucking ripped.
Correct, right? It doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Like, that guy's the scariest librarian I've ever seen.
But what we are taught to do is that if the shit truly hits the fan and we have to self-evacuate, very similar to what I was explaining in Shadow Cell, if we have to self-evacuate, we know how to steal, we know how to procure, we know how to hit caches so that we can get our hands on the types of tools that we would need to evacuate ourselves from whatever location we're in.
So caches, you mean like those, so there'll be like safe houses that have extra guns, passports, money, like different shit that's like set up, and you kind of know a roadmap. You're like, all right, got to get to this place. This is a point that I need to get that's going to get me to this extraction point. So you got a whole fucking plan.
Exactly. What we call an E&E plan, escape and evasion plan. So we all have those built at all times for all of our various operations. And we are trained on how to use weapons, and we're trained on how to use hand-to-hand combat. But we always want to be able to evacuate clandestinely first.
Yes.
So if we can use the money to have a local pilot fly us across a border, where we can use more money to have a local fisherman drive us up the river, we can get the fuck off the X without anybody even knowing anything happened. Right. Because it was a cash transaction to Joe Bob the pilot and a cash transaction to Billy Bob the boat driver, and we're across a national border. Right.
Yeah.
If that doesn't work, then we have to fall back on the kind of stuff that you see in movies.
Yeah.
Even then, before we, as clandestine operators, before we would actually pull out a weapon, point it at a police officer and shoot it, the national U.S. government would send in a trained team to evacuate us instead.
Right.
What's called an exfiltration. Right. So we would have a team come in that would exfil us to a safe haven.
Yeah.
Navy SEALs, Delta operators, something along those lines. Paramilitary CIA, they would come in and actually exfil us or help us to exfiltrate ourselves.
Yeah. Feels like you guys would be really good at Amazing Race.
I would like to believe that.
If you and your wife like were on Amazing Race, like I'd put money on you for sure.
Inside knowledge, my wife has an anxiety disorder. We talk about that in the book as well. It made her very, very good at what she did, but it would make her very bad at Amazing Race.
That's epic. All right. Well, we made a kind of promise the way we started to go back to understanding consciousness and recognizing that these things that may be on this woo-woo fringe are now actually starting to show scientifically that we just haven't had the tools to measure them in the right way. And all of these beliefs that have been carried by, indigenous peoples, like in the account of Australia for 60,000 years, they know that the rocks have energy and the rocks have spirit. They just know that. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, we know this. But then you tell that to somebody in our Western world, and they're like, what do you mean? It's just a fucking rock. And so, from your own experience, you tell a pretty amazing story of measuring energetics at this place, I think, called Satan's Butte, where you went up with a Navajo elder. And I think that's actually part of your own, in like your own genetic lineage, right? So tell us what you experienced just briefly there and how it's kind of expanded your mind to a global paradigm of what this world is that we're living in.
So I was part of a investigative team that was invited to the Navajo Nation to explore this historic site called Satan's Butte. And there were no Navajo that were willing to guide our team to the top of Satan's Butte to carry out our investigation, to measure our different energy readings, to assess the energetics of the region, which is really what our investigation was into, was the energetics. What can we measure about Satan's Butte as a strange site of significance for spiritual and electromagnetic reasons? So we found one elder who was actually on the fringe of being both the Navajo elder and Navajo spokesperson to the outside world. The only reason he was willing to take us up there was because he felt a personal responsibility to bridge the gap between traditional Navajo beliefs and modern day science, right? Fantastic guy. His name was Art. Wonderful guy. So Art escorts me, just the two of us, up to the top of Satan's Butte. And nobody has been on the top of Satan's Butte for months, if not years, right? Because nobody goes there. It's off limits in the Navajo culture, and the Navajo Nation is essentially off limits to the outsiders. So we go up to Satan's Butte. We measure electromagnetic readings. We measure radiation readings. We measure radio energy readings. What tools we have that we can measure scientifically in our current database, we take those up and we use that to get a baseline of Satan's Butte. We find very high radiation levels, which isn't surprising because that's an area of nuclear testing. It's an area of high natural irradiation. So we're not surprised necessarily by that. But then we see almost no radioactivity and we see very little electromagnetic energy. Well, then I go back with Art to collect the rest of the team. The rest of the team is two more historic kind of experiencers who have seen scary stuff at Satan's Butte, plus my team, plus all of our scientific support team, all of our camera people, our audio people, our people who are there to help us record the whole event, right? We drag everything up to the top of Satan's Butte, same day, but later in the day. And everything changes up there. The electromagnetic energies are through the roof. The radio frequencies are through the roof. The radiation energy disappears altogether. And our Navajo guide and the people who joined our guide to kind of be security, they all start having their own spiritual responses to this mountain at the same time that this incredible weather anomaly is forming over Satan's Butte simultaneously. Strong winds, lightning, rain that only exists over us. All of it documented, all of it measured. And I'm sitting there logically trying to scientifically collect as much information as I can, and it doesn't make any sense, right? Meanwhile, the teams around me, including my own team of people who are there to support us but don't really know what's going on, they're all starting to freak out because at the very least, they're afraid of getting struck by lightning. But to a larger extent, they're wondering what the fuck just happened to change the whole makeup of this mountain in a matter of a few hours. Me, I'm just wondering why this energy was present before and it's not there now. This energy that wasn't present before is present now. What happened here? So we collect our data. We get off the mountain before it becomes any kind of health to life and limb and safety, only to then find out that part of the reason that mountain is deemed to be so off limits in the Navajo belief system is because they believe that there's a place where two worlds cross on Satan's Butte. It's essentially what they call a portal now. But what the Navajos consider, the Navajo belief is that the world was formed by deities climbing through portals from world to world. So I think our world is like the seventh portal that someone climbed up to then colonize our world, to create our world. So the Navajos believe that that's basically the umbilical cord. Satan's Butte is basically the umbilical cord for all of our planet. It's like the birthplace where somebody came out and where evil entities can still come out. I had never heard of anything like that before. I had never experienced anything like that. I never looked through the optic of that before. But then when I reviewed our data, it looked like what our data was doing was echoing at different frequencies, which would align with this idea of having different levels of existence in that moment. It's hard to even say it out loud because it sounds ludicrous. The only reason I'm comfortable saying it at all is because other investigators besides me have looked at the same data, rewatched the same footage, and come to the same conclusion where they're like, it looks like it's almost like a weak spot in the fabric of time and space that further lends credibility to the idea that we're all just transient, that energy itself that creates and forms into solid matter, that creates and forms into different personalities, different thoughts, that the actual electromagnetic energy in our brains, when we sit next to each other, that energy transfer between us can literally change the atmosphere and the environment that we're in. That was the conclusion that we came to on Satan's Butte. It's the strangest conclusion, but in many ways, it's also a very liberating conclusion because to me, it tells me that there's not only more than what we see, there's so much more that we are ill-equipped right now to even be able to measure it.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. Obviously, with the years I've had in my own plant medicine journeys, I've experienced things that defy traditional materialist reductionist explanations. So this is something that I'm quite comfortable with. And when people talk about, extra dimensional entities, I'm like, yeah, like which ones? Like I got a lot of experiences here. Like I know that these are things that my mind didn't just project personally, but I can't convince you that. You can believe that I was just taking drugs and hallucinating things, but I know it was something different. There's no way I know the limits of my imagination, and I know the difference between these visions that I have and actually me having an imaginatory experience with something like that. So I'm comfortable with that. And actually what it's inspired me to do is to try and create an ontological worldview of like what is real with the traditional beliefs, which I think are often right, but also sometimes metaphorical, kind of pointing the way towards a deeper truth, and try to bring this all together into a reality that makes sense to me. But it's, and I think we're going to see that more and more as like different things happen that we all know, like if most of us have had some kind of experience where we go, it doesn't quite line up with the traditional worldview. I think we can kind of collect that, and we're going to see a shift in what we understand. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about, just briefly, there's been a whole host of these sightings of like crafts or energetic phenomena. I remember I posted one and it was like this Merkaba in the sky that was like shaping and transforming. And I was like, basically this is one of two things. One, this is a fake video. Certainly possible. AI can produce a bunch of crazy shit. There's lots of reports of these things happening. Or two, this is some kind of phenomenon, some kind of contact with something that we're not accounting for. I remember somebody in the comment goes, "It's just a plasmoid, bro." And I'm like, it's just a plasmoid? Like, when did that become a normal fucking thing where fucking Merkaba sacred geometry plasmoids appear in the air? Like, that's exactly what I'm saying. It's like, you can't just because it has a name doesn't mean that this is like normal now.
Yeah. So what I find so interesting is that there's actual data that demonstrates through EEG, electroencephalogram readings, that human brains and the electrical impulses that they create are triggered, generated, and traversed through different parts of the brain based on the individual. So To make that simpler, what that means is if you were to look at the brick wall behind you and I were to look at the brick wall behind you, the electromagnetic activity in our brains would be uniquely different, right? That would trigger certain memories for you that it doesn't trigger for me, certain questions for you that it doesn't trigger for me. It might trigger certain responses to me to the color that it doesn't trigger for you. So our actual EEGs would look different. Here's what's really fucked up. If you and I look at that wall sitting next to each other together, there's a third variance that occurs. Just because your electrical brain field and my electrical brain field are within proximity to each other.
So like a collective resonance of this kind of mirror neuronal effect where we're actually seeing the same thing.
That's measurable. Whoa is right, dude. The idea that it could happen sounds woo-woo. The idea that you can actually measure it is fucking crazy. Super cool, right? Because now what happens if we put 5 people staring at that wall? What happens if we find a way to harness the new energy that's being created by the fact that there's just 2 of us looking at the wall?
Right.
That's energy that wasn't there before. When I hear about people having sightings in the sky, in many ways, what I'm thinking of is that they're looking at a brick wall and they're having their own reaction, their own EEG response, right? Electrical impulse response in their brain to what they're seeing. The more eyes that see the thing, whether it's social media or whether it's collective sightings because it happened at a football game, right? The more people that see it, the more energy is being created because they all have their own different response to the thing that they're seeing. And then when you put those people into proximity, the more it creates, the more is generated further. Some might call that like a collected hysteria or a mass hypnosis or something along those lines. I am more willing to believe that the energy is going to the thing, almost as if the thing presented itself as a sink to generate energy, possibly to feed itself. Does that mean it's intelligent? Not necessarily. It could be completely and totally biological that we just have no idea about, like a whirlpool or a tornado. It just happens, right? There's enough high pressure and low pressure and it turns itself in a direction because of temperature, and now all of a sudden you have a little vortex sand dirt devil in Arizona. It could be the same kind of thing that we're looking at right now. Who knows? But what's super interesting to me is if you look at it at a macro level, if you do ask yourself the question about intelligent life in the universe or extra dimensional creatures that might be interested in you or me or the rest of the human race, when they see a human being, they see a little self-powered source of energy that can literally create more or less energy based off of the thoughts that we're having at any given moment.
Right.
You read an erotica novel, you create strawberry flavored energy.
Right.
You read a fucking sci-fi novel, you create cumin flavored energy. Who knows? But
Human for sure.
But we can generate energy. And I mean, that's not too much of a stretch from the human experience. We're all on the hunt for sources of energy, whether it's a banana, whether it's somebody that will listen to us when we talk, or whether it's a rare earth mineral in the ground.
Yeah. It's also an interesting thought to me is I think about like the ancient pantheons of gods, and some of them are actively worshipped in the polytheistic cultures, like in Kashmir Shaivism or Hinduism. There's many different gods, from Shiva to Kali to Durga to Hanuman to all of these different beings. But then I also go back to formerly, in my mind, I would think, okay, well, maybe maybe some of these beings are real, but some of them are, probably just made up. And I always thought of like the Greek gods and goddesses, like there's stories. And maybe, but then also when people actively worship through the process of collectively identifying and almost like aggregating from the archetypal structures that are available in capital M mind of the collective consciousness, when they focus all of that attention to carve out borders that actually, whether the entity was real in primacy and people were actually downloading the information, or whether it was created by the collective belief, what I've realized is like these things exist. And again, I don't understand whether they were like primeval and they like began that way, or whether through the collective belief we created what's called an egregore, or this like collection of energy around something that is then able to be interacted with in an interesting way. But I think this all points to how this is like a co-created cosmos where it goes kind of back and forth. And like even those strange stories about like Tinkerbell. And if you don't believe in fairies, fairies don't exist anymore. It's almost like fairies could be like one of these things. Maybe they have always existed, or they started to exist because people believed in them. And then as soon as people stop believing in them, a new fairy falls out of the collection of existence.
And here is where the ruthlessness of intelligence operations sets in. Because a lot of what you're saying is why? Why does it exist? Is it this or is it that? Where did it come from? When it comes to operations and the operations mindset, we don't care why.
Right.
We just care about what can we do with it.
Yeah.
Clearly it exists. How do we use it?
Yeah.
Because if we don't use it, somebody else will use it against us.
Yes.
Right? So that's where CIA sets in. That's why they don't really care about why it is that people can read minds or why it is that remote viewing works, which I've seen evidence that remote viewing is a very valid, very viable, true, effectual way of a collective of human consciousness projecting itself into a different place and bringing back measurable data. I've seen it. I don't really care why it works. What I care about is how do we use this? How do we harness this? How do we direct this, right? How do we make it tangible? Business owners are going to understand this. Entrepreneurs are going to understand this because that is a competitive edge.
Yep.
Right. Generals and intelligence operators are going to understand this because they're like, yeah, that's going to keep good guys alive and put bad guys in the ground. That's what CIA is after. Not why it exists, but how to use it. And if we can learn to use Zeus and the energy that was created collectively by the idea of Zeus, if we can learn how to use it, what happens if we can generate that on our own? What happens if we can go into the middle of sub-Saharan Africa and create a deity that people believe and actually harness the energy that comes from it, right? What is the idea that America is the leader of the free world? That's nothing more than just a construct. Yeah. We've done many things that demonstrate that we are not leaders in a free world. We have done many things that demonstrate that we do not believe in individual freedom, right? We have done many things that run counterpoint to the promise that we make our allies and the rest of the world. But yet that idea continues to persist. And think about how much energy, how much value, how much tangible benefit we get from the proposition, from that propagating idea that we are the leader of the free world. I mean, if it works in politics, if it works in influence, if it works in marketing, I say I have the world's best cup of coffee, people come buy my coffee. It's just an idea. If it works on that kind of micro level, why wouldn't it work? On a larger level? Why wouldn't it work if a bunch of people within 150 square mile radius believe that the top of that mountain is evil? Yeah. Like Satan's Butte. Yeah. Wouldn't that collective energy project measurable energy onto the top of that mountain? Science would say yes, it does.
Yeah. Man, this has been one of my favorite conversations ever. This is so awesome, brother. Thank you so much for what you do. And also, the courage during your time in service. We didn't get into the military portion of your service, but the courage of your time in service in the armed forces, the courage of your time as an operator, and the courage to share your story and devote yourself clearly and obviously to the betterment of the world. So thank you, brother.
My pleasure, man. Thanks for having me, Aubrey.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. We love you guys, and see you next week.
Thanks for tuning into this video. Make sure you hit subscribe. Follow me at Aubrey Marcus. Check out the Aubrey Marcus podcast, available everywhere. And leave a comment. Let me know if this video resonated or what else you would like to hear from me in the future. Thank you so much.